Hi everyone, this is Marcus, and this is going to be the first in a series of videos about William James' book, The Will to Believe. But before we get into the book, I wanted to introduce William James for those of you who may not be familiar. He lived from 1842 to 1910, and oftentimes he gets put as almost like a B tier thinker maybe in the history of philosophy, but I think he's A, if not S or S plus tier. He's one of my favorites. Maybe that's just me, but he's known primarily for his work in two different fields. The first being psychology. He's known very much for this book, Principles of Psychology. It's this big, thick 1,000-page book that gets used a lot of times in as a foundational text in psychology, because he was actually doing psychology at the time that it started to become its own academic discipline, different from philosophy. So they were doing psychology experiments. And so you started to think of a psychologist as a person that was trained in a specific field, a specific science. But his psychology was a little bit different from most, and psychology looks a little bit different in the way he was doing it. Another famous text that he wrote was the Varieties of Religious Experience, which me and Caleb are also doing some other videos on. And what it is essentially is an analysis of religion, but it's focused on the prayer lives of people. That's the way he phrases it. So it's more about the experiences that people have in their personal lives that they associate with religion in any way. And he's trying to find patterns and stuff in between religions, within religions, between different religious traditions, and so on and so forth. But he's also famous for stuff that he did in philosophy. And this is where I first got interested in him. He's associated with the pragmatist school of philosophy, and he's considered one of the three classical pragmatists, along with Charles Peirce and John Dewey. So I don't want to go too much into stuff about pragmatism, but really simply, you can put it the way that Charles Peirce put it, that a statement is meaningless unless it implies a conditional imperative, or it's meaningless unless it has a practical implication on how you're going to behave. So I could have a belief like, oh, is God pink or is God blue? Well, if God is pink or blue, how is that going to affect the way that I act in the world? So it's I can tell you I believe this one is true or this one is true, but it doesn't actually change the way that I respond to anything. But if I say, oh, I think that God is omnipresent or God is not omnipresent, it's going to affect the way what I think I can get away with, right? Because God can't see me doing some things if I think he's not omnipresent. So it has an actual implication on the way that I'm going to act in the world. So, and James released a number of lectures on pragmatism in 1907, shortly before he died. And one of the phrases that stuck out in that book to me is, the true is a species of the good. So it's not like, oh, you have a bunch of beliefs and those are true or false, and then you have to figure out what to do about them, and that's good and evil. It's much more like, oh, when you're thinking, you're doing part of the world. So when you're thinking, you are acting. So you need to think about, are my beliefs, is the purpose of my thinking serving something greater? So when I say that what I believe is true, it means it's good to believe. Just like if I'm talking about any other action, it's a good action, it's a moral action if it is good to do that action, just like thinking is its own kind of action. But so the book that we're going to be going through in this series is a collection of talks and essays that was compiled in 1896, and it's called The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy. So the idea is that I'm going to be doing one video per chapter, and I'll put the link to the description, the link to the book in the description below. It's on Gutenberg.org. But then I realized also I'm making videos on this, so why? I mean, what's the point? Why don't you? If you can read the book, just read the book. But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so today I'm just going to go through the preface to this collection that gives some sort of sweeping thoughts by James and some clues into what the rest of the book is going to be like. So right at the beginning of the preface, he mentions this phrase, radical empiricism, that's gotten associated with James over the year. And he says it's not so much a philosophy itself, about the world is this way or the world is that way, but it's an attitude towards how we're going to be doing philosophy, and how the essays in this collection, his approach is the radical empiricist approach. So what do the two parts of that mean? Well, first, empiricism. Usually empiricism gets associated with like sense data, something about that. Well, and that's important to James, but that's not what's important about empiricism as he sees it. Uh, what he sees important about empiricism is that your beliefs are sort of all hypotheses. So when I say I believe this, I mean I'm putting it forward as a hypothesis, and I'm kind of living out that hypothesis, but I'm willing to modify my beliefs based on future information. So I'm an empiricist if I believe things based on what I know at the time, but as things progress, I might change my mind. So my beliefs don't have any kind of like base certainty claim to them, like another attitude towards philosophy might do. But then when he says that he thinks that he wants to do radical empiricism, then he wants us to take our normal notions of empiricism and expand them to absolutely everything. So the phrase that he uses is even the doctrine of monism, which we're going to be getting into, is treated as a hypothesis. So even things of religious and moral and metaphysical things, these can be approached with an empirical attitude. So the distinction between monism and pluralism is actually something that he gets into a lot in the future lectures, and he had a whole book later in his life called A Pluralistic Universe. So I don't want to go too much into the difference between them here, but just simply, the way that he puts it is that the world, as it normally confronts us in experience, is a pluralism. There's a whole bunch of different things. There's a bunch of disconnected nuggets of experience that kind of attack us. And the only unity among this plurality is that all of this different things are happening all at the same time. So it's like a bucket of Legos. The only thing that's common about all those Legos is that they're all in the same bucket. So the purpose of our higher thinking is to redeem this pluralistic ooze from the primordial chaos that we experience, and we want to make sense and understand the deeper connections, the laws, the patterns that's behind the massive experience. So it's our job to make a unity out of pluralism. So when someone tries to come up with some absolutist system that will never be changed in the future, it's not really going to work. There's always going to be stuff at the edges. He uses the phrase ever not quite. So we have these hypotheses, we have these things that we put forward, but it's usually not going to absolutely capture everything. And if you have, you can sort of come up with some background absolutistic thing. So if I say, oh well, all of these things in the world, they may seem all chaotic, but actually it's not chaotic because God has a plan for all of these things. And you can postulate that, and that might work at unifying them in the back of your mind abstractly, but it's still, there's still a pressure that I need to deal directly with these things. So I need to know maybe more intermediate principles. I can't just know, okay, well, God has a plan for all these things, and so I now know basically how to live in the world, live in all this chaos perfectly. No, that doesn't exactly help me entirely. That doesn't mean that the thing about God is not true, but it means that I'm going to need a little bit more practical advice than just that. So this is one of these things that, I don't know, I had a book of this when I was a kid and I completely forgot about it. I think my dad had it. And basically it's these pictures that when you look at them, it just seems like there's like a kind of a loose pattern to them, but there's nothing actually going on here. But if you put your nose right up to it, I tested this, so it does work on a computer screen. If you put your nose right up to it, and draw it out kind of slowly, but without exactly focusing your eyes. You can look up like instructions on how to do magic eye pictures. You can actually see a pattern. And then when you're at a certain point, the pattern kind of like locks, and then you can kind of maneuver and see more. I really don't know how to describe it, but you kind of have to do it yourself. So we can this is how the world normally confronts us. This is how like babies see. This is how I would imagine like a baby that has no sense or direction in the world. This is how the world kind of attacks them. And then slowly they pull, and then when you can put yourself in a situation where you can pull yourself out and you can see these patterns, but only if you get an intimate familiarity with the particulars. So I don't know, maybe take a couple minutes, maybe pause the video, try to figure out how to do that. Look it up, try to do other puzzles. I haven't done this one, so I don't actually know what the picture is. So put that in the comments. So there's always something outside of your point of view. There's always something on the fringe. If you've seen Jonathan Peugeot's videos, he talks about in Mosaic law, the you're always required after you harvest your grain to leave some at the edge for the extra. There's always this concept of um, you don't know what's happening at the edge of your territory, so you need to account for it. So this is kind of what James is recommending doing in philosophy. We have all this stuff that we're trying to explain. So if we pretend like we have it all under control, we're actually kind of kidding ourselves. And so there's no totalizing, absolutely totalizing point of view. So if you think of the Eye of Sauron, Sauron thought of himself as kind of a god king, and so he tries to get he tries to put himself on top of a tower, the Tower of Barad-dûr, so that he can see the entire landscape. But there was something acting on the fringe of Sauron, and it was Frodo and Sam. And so he thought, oh, as long as I focus on the big players, I've basically covered all the important data. But Frodo and Sam was the single tiny piece that was absolutely crucial to defeating Sauron. So in the empiricist mode, usually it's important to think of a degree of permanence to pluralism. There's probably never going to be any one system that absolutely accounts for every single thing that you might encounter in the world. So James notes that the first 4 essays of the collection are on defending the legitimacy of religious faith. So many scientists at his time, it's becoming much more popular to say that it's a sad misuse of academic life to try to promote this kind of thing. And many scientists are sneering at faith, but James couldn't disagree more. He says that it is true that men probably have too much faith in various things. They tend to go on these fanatical crazes in this direction or that direction. And there's many religious groups, traditional religious groups, that need to sort of maybe be aired out of some beliefs that they hold that they don't no longer need to hold. There's, of course, room for reform in religion. Very few people deny that. But what he wants to know is that scientists have their own faith, and they just have this faith that out there in the world somewhere is scientific evidence, and it's just waiting to be discovered, and it's their job to go out and discover it. And so no one should get in the way of their holy crusade. So quoting James, he says, but there is really no scientific or other method by which men can steer safely between the opposite dangers of believing too little or of believing too much. To face such dangers is apparently our duty, and to hit the right channel between them is the measure of our wisdom as men. So it's our job to go out into the world and figure out when we should double down on faith and when we should kind of take a step back and try to be much more calm-headed about a situation. But he does want to defend those hot-headed, faith assumptive kind of moments. So the phrase that he kind of comes up with is, going forward, he wants us to have a science of religions. And usually scientists, he says at the time, they'll bear the fact that religious people even exist in the world, even if that they'll tolerate the disgust at even knowing that someone out there might have faith in something other than their own pet theory. So I'm just going to quote in full what James wrote in this section. He says, if religious hypotheses about the universe be in order at all, then the active faiths of individuals in them, freely expressing themselves in life, are the experimental tests by which they are verified. and the only means by which their truth or falsehood can be wrought out. The truest scientific hypothesis is that which, as we say, works best, and it can be no otherwise with religious hypotheses. They ought therefore not to lie hid each under its bushel, indulged in quietly with friends. They ought to live in publicity, vying with each other, and it seems to me that, the regime of tolerance once granted and a fair field shown, the scientist has nothing to fear for his own interests from the liveliest possible state of fermentation in the religious world of his time. Those faiths will best stand the test which adopt also his, which is the scientist's hypothesis, and make them integral elements of their own. So he's basically inviting the world of science and the world of religion to kind of both live to their fullest, as long as, he says, the regime of tolerance is granted and a fair field shown. Now, what the regime of tolerance is and what the fair field is, that's much more up for debate. But he's kind of saying tolerance does not mean everyone has to stay inside their home. People actually have to actively live out their faith. And actually, when someone is living out their faith, they're kind of doing a little experiment in the science of religion. They're trying to show whether or not this or that dogma works practically. Because remember, the James, you can't believe something if you don't get to live it out. So by telling people that they can believe whatever they want, but they don't get to act it out, is essentially telling them that they can't really believe them at all. So he says the faiths do the most harm when they forget that they are hypotheses and turn themselves into rigid dogma. So when a faith turns itself into this kind of iron-clad, never changes, just a block that sits there, then it can do harm, because then it's not living and breathing and interacting with the world, and it's just kind of forcing itself into the world, trying to conform the world around it, rather than living with the truth of the world, which I think is very interesting. So I just wanted to end with the way that one of the phrases towards the end of the preface, where James says, "The most interesting and valuable things about a man are his ideals and overbeliefs. The same is true of nations and historic epochs, and the excesses of which the particular individuals and epochs are guilty are compensated in the total and become profitable to mankind in the long run." So the next lecture is going to be on the will to believe, probably one of James' most famous essays, probably his most famous essay, really. And so, yeah, it's definitely not one to miss. And I'll see you later.